Okay, so well, let's talk about the deer culling. What was that? What was that like? Tell me about deer culling here.
Well, after I left school, I think my upbringing led me into deer culling, because being born in the Linders Pass, wasn't much social life, and I became probably a bit of a loner, and so I looked around and I thought, you know, one of the things I'd like to do is sort of get into the back country, and just by chance a fella that did quite a bit of work at home in capturing quail. I think he worked for a place a bit like Dock, and anyway, he was a deer culler, and I said to him one day, I wouldn't mind having a go at this deer culling business. So he said, I can get you into that game all right. He said, I've been a deer culler myself, and so he said, when you want to start? And I said, well, I'll start just any time at all. So it was only a couple of months later he came home and he said, I've jacked up this deer culling job for you. He said, you can start right away. He said, I'll take you into Makarora. He said, there's a block up there you can go into. So he took me up to Makarora, and there was nobody at the base camp. The field officer that they normally have there was away somewhere. He said, that's all right. He said, you go up this gully, and he said, there's a hut up there. So he dropped me off at the river and across the river. He said, the hut's about a couple of 3 hours up the valley, so away I went, but I never did get to the hut. It started to get dark and I camped on the riverbank. Fortunately, it was quite a nice evening, and next morning when I woke up, I saw the hut over on the other side of the river, just inside the bush. So I went over and had breakfast. So that was the first night I camped out. So he said there was another dry rock camp, which is a sort of a cave up this side branch. So the next day I went away up there, and I never ever found, I didn't really know what I was looking for, but I never found this dry rock either. So the second night I camped out in the open too. Fortunately, it was a nice night. And so I headed back down the valley, and I run slap bang into this overhanging rock. And I had a look underneath, and sure enough, this was the old deer cullers' camp. So after 7 years of shooting, there were the only 2 nights I ever stayed out. I learnt the hard way.
What was it like here? What was the deer like around the Tarras district?
There was even around here there was a lot of deer on our own place. I used to do a bit of private shooting, but I hadn't done very much shooting before I went deer culling. But the 7 years that I shot well over 10 to 12,000 deer, and I had 3 summer seasons. Although I shot 2 seasons in Southern Lakes here, one in the Haast before the road ever went through. After that I transferred to Canterbury and spent all the last 5 years of my shooting in Canterbury. And on 3 different blocks up there I shot over 2,000 for the summer. One in the Wilberforce I shot over 2,000, and then I did 2 seasons in the Lake Sumner, Hiranui, and I shot over 2,000 on 2 different summers in there. But we shot winter seasons as well. But no, it was interesting, and they've just written a book on the deer culling. It's called Deer Culler Celebration, and there's a chapter in there on my exploits, and in another part of the book they listed the 10 top shooters ever in New Zealand, and they put me in second. But I wasn't surprised, because I shot, the years that I shot in those blocks, I shot over twice as many to 3 times as many as anybody else shot in the whole of the Canterbury area. But the fellow they put in top was a fellow called Percy Dyes, and he shot for over 20 years, and but he was a very good shooter too, and over those years. But anyway, I think we should probably talk about other things.
Let's talk about this area. So what's your association? You've got a long association, haven't you, with this area? Can you tell me how that all started?
Well, my grandfather was definitely on the board that was set up to administer the subdivision of Morven Hills in 1909, and of course Morven Hills was split up into quite a number of properties. I just don't know offhand, but it must have been a dozen or 20. And I think the very last place it was subdivided off and balloted was Geordie Hill Station, and whether it was by design or luck, my grandfather did win that ballot and took over the Geordie Hill Station. Now, a part of the one of the things about it, that anybody that won those ballots actually had to live on the station, so didn't want absentee owners. So he lived up there in a tent camp for the first year on Geordie Hill, in the same valley that I live now, but they actually built the homestead around in the other valley. But the interesting thing was that those property, Geordie Hill, and the next door property called Timburn, which is divided now into Longacre and Timburn, Morven Hills tried to keep those two properties, and it wrangled through the courts for over a year, almost 2 years, before my grandfather was able to take up that property. Morven Hills lost the case, and so we were a wee bit delayed in taking up, so we didn't actually take the Geordie Hill lease up until 1910, which is, so we'll be there 100 years next January. So in 1933, my grandfather divided the Geordie Hill property up into 3 parts, and the part where we live now is Merivale, and so we took over, my father took over Merivale in 1933 and built the homestead where we live now, and the other property was Shulmar, which was in my grandfather's will from my 2 eldest brothers, Eric and Brian. They took over Shulmar. So Shulmar was named after our 2 sisters, Shirley and Marlene. For want of a name, they called it Shulmar. And the name of our place is Merivale. Now, Merivale is named after the Christchurch suburb Merivale, where my mother was actually born and bred and brought up in Merivale, and for want of a name, they called the place Merivale. So that's where we are today. And
what was it like growing up there?
Of course, in those days, the Lindis was pretty a lot more isolated as way as roads and things to what it is nowadays. But in actual fact, there's a lot more people lived in the Lindis in those days than what there are now. We're married rabbiters and road workers, and there was 1 or 2 small farms and different things. Virtually nobody lives up the Lindis now except those 4 or 5 sheep stations. And not only those, in those days, the sheep stations had quite a big staff, you know, haymaking and things. And but farming's become so mechanised nowadays. There's very few people actually work on the places, and even on my own place, I run the place myself without help. So there's just not the people about. And there's no rabbiters living about nowadays. So there's very few people there. Of course, in those days, we had a school up there. I was one of the latter enrolments at the school. My sister Shirley and I went to the last ones, the Goodger family that went to the Lindis Pass school before it was transferred down here to Tarras. And you know, even the old boarding house up there was built as a hotel, one of the first hotels outside of Dunedin. It was lost the licence, I think, about the time of the First World War, but it was carried on as a boarding house. But at the boarding house was actually a shop and a telephone exchange as well. So, and it was not very far from the school. But now there's actually nobody lives around in that part of the Lindis at all. Interesting enough, most of those high country places were pastoral lease, but in recent times they've been freeholded. We freeholded only 4 or 5 years ago, part of the 6 farms in the Lindis that freeholded. I think there's only 2 places left up there that's still pastoral lease, but the part of the freeholding of 9 Mile Station was the old Lindis Pass boarding house, which is completely derelict, no roof on anything. But anyway, part of the freeholding of this property, DOC, Department of Conservation, bought the old building for $50,000, and they've sort of strengthened some of the doorways and window frames and things that was sort of looked like it might collapse any time soon. And one part of it did collapse with a slight earthquake just after they bought it, and they put that wall back in. But that's a real tourist attraction now. A lot of people, they've got a right of way up to that old building. And
something that surprised me in my research is that tourism has actually been quite big here right from the early 1900s. Is that something you've been aware of growing up?
Well, yes. I think what's made it more so in recent times that this freeholding of these properties on our own place. There's a public road now right out to the back of our place, and there's 2 public car parks out there. So people are going to be going out there mountain biking, and that sort of thing has become very popular now, hiking around and mountain biking, and I think people can go out horse trekking and things like that. Over into that Dunstan area in the St Bathans Range, and and the likes of that hotel, there's people going up there and up onto top of Linda's Peak, which we can see from here. There's a walking track, and it starts off at Elliott's Bridge, not very far from our gateway. And there's always cars parked out there and people walking up there. And I've been up there recently with my grandchildren up onto the top of Linda's Peak, and it's a very popular walk. And when you get up there, you get a great view of the whole area around these parts.